Hi guys. Today we're going to talk about a time period in history that we're not too proud of, but we need to talk about and we need to remember. Because if it happened then, it could happen again. Today, we're talking about the Palmer raids. The Palmer raids happened in 1919 and 1920 following World War I. The United States had just come back victorious. Woodrow Wilson was out trying to negotiate the League of Nations, and what we found was a time period where we should have been celebrating and enjoying our victory over in Europe. However, what we were actually experiencing was very uneasy and uncertain times in our country. In fact, you could say there was a lot of unrest in America. We were experiencing an economic downturn. Inflation had hit once the war ended. On top of that, we're seeing a lot of labor strikes occurring throughout our society. Not just with like the steel industry or the coal industry like we've experienced before, but also groups like the Boston Police Department are going on strike. Unemployment is starting to climb as soldiers come back to work and they're finding there just isn't that much work available. Industry has cut back on production because they don't need to do the same levels that they were doing during the war. This idea of a nativism and America first is starting to grow in our country. And I mean, we just fought this great war to make the world safe for democracy. And yet it didn't work because of what's going on in Russia. You had the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And when we look at how that came about, the ideas are very similar to what Americans are seeing within their own home. In Russia, they had an economic downturn. They were experiencing high inflation. They had a lot of labor strikes and labor unrest going on. And that made them what Americans viewed as ripe for the picking. And if it could happen there, Americans are wondering, man, it can happen here too. So to really understand how we got to a point that, the United States resulted or reached the Palmer raids, you have to understand what Americans were feeling at this time. A lot of Americans were feeling helpless. They didn't have answers to the questions they were asking. They felt uncertain about the future. Where were we going and what were we going to be doing? And finally, they felt uneasy. They felt uneasy because they didn't have the economic stability that we'd had before. Our president was focused on this League of Nations and what's going on with that. And you had over our shoulder, we look back at Russia and everything that happened there. It's very understandable to see why there was this fear that was starting to slowly boil up within our country. Now, I want to pause here for a minute and talk about the Sedition Act of 1918. This was passed during World War I as an extension of the Espionage Act of 1917. Now, the Espionage Act, as you remember, was put in place to stop traffic of information about the United States that could lead to destruction or, problems for the U.S. Army while they were fighting. It's not uncommon for locations of deployed spouses to be held or hid from their significant other just to protect them, and that way we don't have to worry about any leaks or anything like that. Well, that's why this Espionage Act of 1917 was set up. Now, the Sedition Act of 1918 is created to protect speech that was going out in America. And not protect our speech, but to protect the type of speech that the government wanted to control. The Sedition Act of 1918 was primarily directed at activists, anti-war activists, pacifists, and socialists who may be speaking out against the war. And the type of speech that it outlawed was anything that was considered disloyal to the United States, as well as profane language against the United States, scandalous speech or stories that could have come out, and finally abusive speech. So all of this is going to be fall under the Sedition Act of 1918. Now, I put this out there now because it's going to be the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 that is going to lead to Attorney General Palmer literally start a witch hunt throughout our country looking for radicals. All right, let's step back into our story. Let's go to 1919 in New York City in the Maine Post Office. And let me talk about a man by the name of Charles Kaplan. Charles Kaplan, an employee of the post office, was working in the back when he came across 16 rather nondescript parcels. And while he looked at these packages, there was nothing that really stood out about them except for one thing. They were lacking the right amount of postage. So Kaplan pushed these packages to the side and went about his business. And later that day, as he was riding the train home, he happened to be reading the newspaper. And there was an article about a package that had been delivered to a Senator Hardwick. And when that package had been delivered, the senator's maid opened it and it exploded, causing injury to both the maid and the senator. As Hardwick read the article, or I'm sorry, excuse me, as Kaplan read the article, he realized that this sounds an awful like the packages that he set aside at the New York City post office. He immediately got off the train and went back to the post office, called the postal inspector as well as the New York City Bureau of Combustibles. They came in and inspected the packages and found that they did indeed contain instruments of infernal machines or incendiary devices. They put out an alert immediately because some of the names that were listed on these boxes included people like J.P. Morgan Jr., J.D. Rockefeller, as well as numerous other politicians and judges and the mayor of New York City. This alert goes out to all post offices throughout the United States as they believe that they actually have a serial bombing plot. When the warning goes out, they come to find 36 more packages addressed to other politicians and judges throughout the country, primarily North Carolina, the New England region, as well as Utah. The investigation they're going to start investigating what became known as the May Day bomb plot. The press is going to cover it, and they're going to basically put these huge headlines out. You can see there on the left, the Chicago Daily Tribune, send death bombs to 36 United States leaders. Other headlines included an article that was leaked by someone in the Justice Department that stated there was 2,000 radical agitators in the city of New York just at that time, and they were preaching the ideas of Bolshevism and the prospect of overthrowing the United States government. This is going to lead to the Department of Justice investigating further. And what their investigation is going to lead to is a belief that Bolsheviks and the Industrial Workers of the World Union is actually working with the Lenin-Trotsky communist government in Russia to create a revolution in the United States trying to overthrow our government. This is what leads to the first Red Scare in the United States. Now I want to introduce you to A. Mitchell Palmer. Palmer had been appointed as the Attorney General by President Wilson. Now, when the May Day bombing plot came out, a lot of Republicans criticized him because they didn't think he acted swiftly enough or strongly enough with the suspects in hand. That's going to change, however, though, on June 2nd, 1919. A man by the name of Carlo Valdinocci is going to deliver a package to Palmer's home in New York City. Now, fortunately for Palmer, he had already retired upstairs to the second floor of his home for the evening. As Valdinocci approached his home, the bomb that he was carrying exploded early. Now, this bomb was much stronger than what the other 36 packages had been sent out for the May Day bombing plot. In fact, this bomb contained 23 kilograms of dynamite laden with shrapnel and metal pieces with the design to do a lot of damage. And it did. This bomb was so much stronger than the previous ones. It not only did extensive damage to the first floor of Palmer's home, but it also damaged the second floor, as well as blowing out the windows of the house across the street. Now, when those windows blew out of Palmer's neighbor's house, the residents came running out, a man and his wife, to help. Just for some trivia, I'll throw out at you, that man was Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. Within 90 minutes of the bomb exploding at Palmer's house, 7 more bombs exploded in different cities throughout the United States, including New York City, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Boston, Philadelphia, and Paterson, New Jersey. This is going to, light a fire under Palmer, and he is going to start a major investigation. Now, what he's going to find is that he's going to be led to a print shop in New York City owned by Luigi Galleani. You see, when the would-be bomber approached Palmer's house, what they found on his body was hundreds of flyers for an anarchist movement. And that's how they traced the movement back to Galleani. Galleani's print shop had actually printed those flyers, and they found later that Galleani was actually the head of an anarchist movement. Now, a little background about Galleani. He originally lived in Italy and was studying to be a lawyer at the University of Turin. A year prior to his graduation, he did get in trouble with the law and charges were filed against him. He fled Italy and went to France, where he lived for nearly 20 years. Once he started an anarchy movement as well in France, and they expelled him from the country. He tried to get into Switzerland. They would not let him in. He eventually ends back up in Italy, where he is arrested and put in jail. Galleani is able to escape jail, and he makes his way to England. From England, he migrates to the United States of America. Once he arrived in America, he did face trouble with the law here in New Jersey. He was arrested for inciting a riot, and then that's when he moved to New York City and started his print shop. Now, he had quite a few followers. Two of his most prominent followers are names you probably know, Sacco and Vanzetti. These were the two men that went on trial accused of murdering a federal paymaster, which spurred a lot of protests throughout not only our country, but throughout the world. Palmer is going to, once he finds Galleani and he finds this movement, he is going to engage the Espionage Act of 1917 as well as the Sedition Act of 1918. And in doing so, he is going to create a team whose sole purpose is to investigate the existing suspects they have in the previous bombings, as well as seek out anyone in the country who may, attack the United States in the same way. Now, one of his leading team members is the man there on the right, a young J. Edgar Hoover. After months of investigation, Palmer's team puts together a list of nearly 10,000 suspects. And Palmer is convinced at this point that there is a communist plot to overthrow the United States. And the thing about this suspect list is it wasn't directly tied to anyone. Well, I mean, there were people who had committed crimes. There were people who incited anti-American speech and activities. However, there were a lot of people on this list who basically made the list because someone said, I think you might look a little shady. I'm not quite sure about you. We're putting your name on the list. And this list is actually going to grow over time. This is what's going to lead to the Palmer raids, which is what we're talking about today. The Palmer raids actually started on November 7th, 1919. And it started with a coordinated raid that went through 12 cities in our country, where agents of the Justice Department went into numerous locations and arrested suspected the communists and radicals within our country. One location that was raided during that day was in New York City. It was the Russian People's House. Now, the Russian People's House was the home to the Office of the Federated Union Workers of Russia. It also housed a cafeteria and classrooms for those Russian immigrants who were trying to learn English and other skills within America. When Palmer's agents raided that, they didn't just raid. They did have warrants to arrest 12 different people. However, they ended up arresting everybody. They didn't just arrest them, they mistreated them as well. They trashed the inside of the office. You can kind of see that in the picture there above. There was reports of them beating everyone there with the railings and blackjacks and stuff like that. They were pushing people down the stairs. And it just turned into this massive, I guess, bullying session. All the suspects were taken to the Department of Justice where they were questioned. After they were all been questioned, about 1/5 of them were held and the others released. The problem was the 4/5 or the 80% of those arrested who were released were severely injured or beaten. Now, a group of lawyers got together and sent a letter to the Justice Department questioning the tactics that were being used by Palmer and his agents. However, that letter was completely ignored and never acknowledged whatsoever. The next day, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, another raid took place. And in this raid, they raided a meeting of Russian immigrants who were meeting basically to discuss the purchase of a vehicle in which they could all share and then learn to drive and such. In this raid, 63 people are going to be arrested. Now, 16 will be released rather quickly, but the remaining 47 will be transferred to the Hartford jail. While there, more arrests will be made. In total, 93 people will be arrested and put in the Hartford jail. Some of those arrested were actually family members visiting the men who had been arrested, and as they were visiting, they were considered to be co-conspirators, so they were arrested on the spot. While in prison, these men also were mistreated. They were usually given roughly 2 to 3 minutes per day sink time to clean themselves up, and 5 minutes per month for tub time where they could clean their bodies. Typically, they were put in rooms for questioning that were about 4 by 8. These interrogation rooms sat above a boiler room, so there was excruciating heat and exhausting heat that would come out, and they would be left in these rooms for 36 to 48 hours with 1 glass of water and 1 slice of bread. After questioning, they would be returned to their jail cell. The reports say that of all those questioned and all those who were taken to those interrogation rooms, only 1 person was ever able to walk back to his cell by his own strength. During their questioning, there's reports that the agents were threatening to hang the suspects, suffocate the suspects, and basically deport them as well. In the end, the majority, by December, most of these people had been deported back to Russia, and they had been sent on a ship that was nicknamed the Red Ark. Again, another massive raid is going to occur in January of 2020, when a mass raid is going to go through 35 different cities and 3,000 people are going to be arrested. Now, keep in mind, these arrests, no warrants were issued, no documentation was ever made. What Palmer's agents and groups tried to do was come in after the fact and draft different warrants. So this was going on throughout the country, and what you need to realize is as these raids went on, it wasn't just groups and businesses that were being raided. There were times when people were set up or basically entrapped into covering, their or not covering, but they were set up to look like communist agents. There's a story of Julia Pratt, who had been a teacher in I can't remember exactly where she was, but in Buffalo, I'm sorry. And she was invited to a dinner party. At that dinner party, a man by the name of Bernard came, and he arrived at the dinner party with 2 other women. And throughout the dinner party, he was talking about the Communist Party and what a great idea it would be to overthrow this U.S. government because it was not doing its job and stuff like that. Julia Pratt basically sat there as a guest in someone's home and just kind of nodded her head a little bit. The next thing you know, she is dismissed from her job as a teacher, and at her hearing, this man Bernard shows up, and turns out he is an undercover agent for the U.S. government who has infiltrated the Buffalo Communist Party. And he claims that he has receipts of funds and dues that have been paid by Julia Pratt to the Communist Party, though these receipts are never turned over or released to the board. So basically, Julia Pratt gets up and says, I'm losing my job on the word of this one man. And what's happened here is a severe case of entrapment. And this was just one incident where this happened. When we look at the Palmer raids, the whole purpose was the whole purpose of the Palmer raids is going to be to get immigrants out of our country. And we will see quite a few people deported. By the time this is all over 263 people will have been deported. Now, there were orders to deport even more. And this, basically is going to be stopped by an undersecretary of labor who's going to look at the reports against these people and the warrants, and he's going to determine that it's not justified. That man is Louis F. Post. Like I said, he was the Assistant Secretary of Labor for the United States, and he actually cancels over 1,500 warrants for deportation. Also, during this time, the ACLU is going to be formed, and they're going to be questioning the practices of Palmer and his agents and the different activities that they're involved in. A group of 12 lawyers are going to come together. Now, after those 3,000 people, or after those 35 cities were raided, there is going to be concern among the American people. And so this is when a group of 12 lawyers are going to come together, and they're going to create the report of illegal practices of the United States Department of Justice. And in this report that they do release to the American people, they charge the government with these 6 violations of constitutional authority. Number 1, they charge them with cruel and unusual punishment, arrest without warrants, illegal search and seizure, entrapment, compelling persons to testify against themselves, and finally, propaganda. Now, of course, Palmer and his men are guilty of all of these charges. However, you're not going to see them ever experience or express any remorsefulness for their crimes. In fact, Palmer is going to leave the Department of Justice, leave his job as the Attorney General, and he is going to go back into private practice. He is actually going to run for the Democratic nomination for the president in 1924, I believe. Now, he is not going to get it. When questioned about his activities with the Palmer raids, Palmer just defended his actions, saying that he was there to protect America. Bottom line, the Palmer raids were allowed to happen because the United States was emboldened with fear of what could happen. And we've seen several times in history that when citizens are afraid of the possibility of something bad happening, they allow the government to go way beyond their bounds. And the Palmer raid is just one example of this. So we take this and we need to learn from it. And we don't learn right away, because what we're going to find in the 1950s is that once again, we will experience what's known as the Second Red Scare. And J. Edgar Hoover, as well as others, are going to poke their heads back up again, and we're going to see all sorts of new charges coming up with regards to this fear of communism coming into our country. So that's what we have for today. Hopefully I answered any questions you might have had about the Palmer raids. Enjoyed talking to you, and we will see you soon. Have a great day.